Fellowship of the Broken, Making Sense of 12-Step Recovery by Angelo. Chapter 23. Hallucinogens. I mentioned hallucinogenic drugs in the previous chapter. This is a subject worth exploring, as it can give insight into the nature of consciousness and also into addiction. I've not taken hallucinogenic drugs myself, nor do I intend to, but a great many people have, and the results seem to be more revealing than we might imagine. Hallucinogens are any substance that causes hallucinations, and hallucinations are experiences involving the apparent perception of something not present. Humans have been experimenting with hallucinogens for thousands of years. Naturally occurring sources of hallucinogens include psilocybin mushrooms and peyote cacti, as well as other plants and even toads. These substances were discovered by ancient cultures and used in various combinations for spiritual practices and ceremonies. Ayahuasca is one such brew that originates from the indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin and is used to this day on some spiritual retreats. LSD, or acid, on the other hand, is a more modern version that was first made in 1938 from lysergic acid, which is a chemical from the ergot fungus. LSD was first used for psychotherapeutic treatments to produce a controlled psychosis, but subsequently became a popular recreational drug in the 1960s. Many influential musicians used LSD during this period, and this contributed to a period of noteworthy musical creativity. A significant catalyst for the popular use of hallucinogens was the publication of the book The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley in 1954. The book documents his experience of taking mescaline, which occurs naturally in the peyote cactus. He took the drug as an experiment to test the idea that the human brain is a reducing valve for consciousness, which, of course, is consistent with the model that we've been exploring. The results were an intense and extraordinary change in perception of everyday life that he describes in fascinating detail. The title for the book was taken from William Blake's poem, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, in which he says, quote, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up, till he sees things through narrow chinks in his cavern." Close quote. Well, this concept of cleansing the doors of perception is the same idea as cleansing the lens of Antakarana in the Advaita Vedanta. The experiences described by Huxley are not dissimilar to reports of spiritual experiences or trips on LSD. All of this clearly points to hallucinogens curtailing the activity of the personal ego mind, which then gives rise to experiences of a deeper consciousness. I always used to think that hallucinations were the result of unusually high brain activity that created unreal experiences. It now seems that hallucinogens reduce brain activity to allow brief glimpses into the nature of the underlying reality of universal mind. This new understanding of the effects of hallucinogens is supported by recent scientific research. There's a great deal of information available on the internet, including multiple experiments by Carhart-Harris et al. From 2010 to 2016 using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, and magnetoencephalography, MEG. In summary, there is clear evidence that LSD and other hallucinogens stimulate the serotonin 2A receptors in the brain, which in turn disrupt coupling between certain cell types and the rhythmic oscillations of large populations of neurons in the cortex. This decreases the communication between the brain regions that make up the default mode network, or DMN, which is a collection of hub centers that work together to control and repress consciousness. The DMN disintegrates under LSD, allowing for more communication between brain networks that are normally highly segregated. This decrease in the DMN has been shown to correlate to the strength of the subjective experience of ego dissolution and unity. It seems that the DMN is the mechanism in the brain that restricts consciousness in order to produce the experience of the personal separate ego self. Once this is suppressed by hallucinogens, then the ego self momentarily dissolves and unrestricted states of consciousness are experienced. This research completely supports and validates the understanding that the personal ego mind is a restricted version of consciousness, and that there is an underlying reality beyond the experience of the day-to-day functioning of mind. Similar techniques have been used to study the effect of meditation on brain activity. Again, it's clear that meditation does change the way the brain functions. And in a recent study published in the Journal of Neuroimage, a team of researchers at the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison has shown key differences in brain activity between non-meditators, new meditators, and long-term meditators. This all adds weight to the suggestion that science is simply pushing back the limits of our current misunderstanding. Deep meditation can produce similar effects to those of hallucinogens. It seems that ancient cultures knew more about the true nature of reality than our supposedly more advanced modern cultures. They were relying more on wisdom than knowledge. There's a certain irony in the modern obsession with science, in that it has undoubtedly made life more comfortable, but this has come at the expense of increased emotional suffering. We've gone too far towards the human end of the spectrum of balance between ego mind and universal mind. Understanding hallucinogens not only helps to validate the model of consciousness that we've been exploring, but it also provides a key insight into the epidemic of addiction that plagues so many of our modern cultures. What's clear is that humans have been trying to escape the inevitable suffering of the ego mind since time immemorial. This sense of longing arises from the restricted nature of the personal ego mind, which, as mentioned previously, is in the nature of a compressed sponge with an inherent tension awaiting release. We have been trying to get out of our minds for thousands of years, and the desire somehow seems to be even stronger these days. Whether it be hallucinogens, alcohol, marijuana, tobacco, recreational drugs, or any habitual behaviour that provides temporary relief, we all seem to need something to help us relax and escape the prisons or caverns of our own minds. And it's interesting that the English language uses such phrases as out of my mind, or off my head, or out of it, or zoned out, to describe such experiences. There is discomfort or dis-ease in living only in the confines of our conditioned ego minds, and one could say that the entire pleasure industry in all of its guises exists primarily to satisfy this inbuilt desire. Our focus on the material world has caused confusion between happiness and pleasure. Happiness is certainly pleasurable, but pleasure is temporary in nature and cannot lead to lasting happiness. Our repeated use of substances and behaviours to find happiness through the momentary release of tension leads to emotional and physical dependence. And this dependence grows stronger as our bodies tolerate more and more of the same substance or behaviour, and this leads to addictions that over time become increasingly difficult to manage or give up. The ego mind seeking escape would be the equivalent of a caterpillar discovering a substance or behaviour that would give it the temporary experience of being a butterfly. The caterpillar has a built-in destiny to become a butterfly through metamorphosis, but it would presumably much prefer to find a way of mimicking the butterfly experience rather than actually having to go through the natural process of transformation. The problem is that the repetitive use of the substance or behaviour has a detrimental impact on the caterpillar's progress towards the intended metamorphosis. It gets trapped in its own caterpillar status, despite its best personal attempts to escape. The unavoidable desire to transform grows ever stronger as time passes, but the increasingly desperate use of the substance or behaviour to address the desire simply makes matters worse. There is a longing for freedom, but an increasing feeling of being trapped and unable to escape. The caterpillar just needs to stop trying and allow the natural process to resume, but the fear of transformation drives it back to the comfort of temporary relief. Such is the cycle of addiction. It's driven by natural desires, but compromised by a simple yet catastrophic misunderstanding of what life is really all about. This is why a life based on spiritual principles and progress is the obvious solution to addiction. It's the only way for consciousness to satisfy its own inherent desire for happiness, peace, love, and unity. I mentioned before that many well-known people have experimented with hallucinogens, and that this has often facilitated creativity. Well, consciousness is creative, and hence it makes sense that access to higher levels of consciousness would inevitably lead to enhanced creativity. Referring again to the spectrum of balance between personal mind and non-personal universal mind, it can be seen that an acid trip would produce a temporary movement in identification from personal to non-personal, and hence to a broader experience of consciousness. The problem is that when the drug wears off, the balance returns to the previous state of personal ego mind. The mistake we can then make is to assume that the non-personal experience was personal. We claim it for ourselves and are convinced that the trip was ours, and that any resulting creativity or insights belong to me. Temporary glimpses of the underlying reality are not permanent, and hence the only way to regain such experiences quickly is by repeated use of the drug. The key to understanding what's happening here is to realize that the experience is only arising due to the momentary absence of the personal self. If hallucination happens whilst the person is typically still firmly identified as a personal self, then there is a severe danger of very frightening experiences and potential for subsequent mental health problems such as psychosis, anxiety, paranoia and despair. It's obviously much better then to allow the balance to shift naturally through regular spiritual practice, rather than trying to jump-start or accelerate progress through the use of drugs. It's for this reason that I do not intend to make use of hallucinogens myself. Interestingly though, one notable and relevant individual who did experiment with LSD was Bill Wilson. His original spiritual experience took place in December 1934 during his fourth admission to Towns Hospital in New York under the care of Dr. Silkworth. The treatment included the belladonna cure, which was a mixture of deadly nightshade, henbane, and the dried bark or berries of the prickly ash. The effects of belladonna included hallucinations. Under the effects of this cocktail, he experienced what he described as the sensation of a bright light, a feeling of ecstasy and a new serenity. Having previously suffered from chronic alcoholism, he never drank again and became convinced that spirituality was the most effective solution to long-term recovery from addiction. In the 1950s, he experimented with LSD, presumably in order to try to re-experience his previous spontaneous spiritual experience. The experiments were medically supervised by psychologist Betty Elsner, philosopher Gerald Hurd, and the above-mentioned Aldous Huxley. Bill Wilson was enthusiastic about the results of these experiments and felt that LSD could be useful, but only for those who had already made significant spiritual progress. He also acknowledged that LSD could never take the place of the existing spiritual means of reducing the personal ego self, because spiritual principles would keep the ego reduced, whereas LSD was a transient experience. Bill Wilson was also impressed by the work of Abram Hoffer, who experimented using LSD to treat alcoholism. Hoffer was also experimenting with niacin to treat schizophrenia. The niacin is an organic compound and a form of vitamin B3, and Wilson discovered that alcoholics given this compound had better sobriety rates. Wilson also took niacin himself and felt that it gave him relief from depression, from which he had continued to suffer since getting sober. Bill Wilson never claimed to be a model of recovery, and his continuing search to find ways to improve recovery rates reflected this. His self-description was a man who, quote, because of his bitter experience, discovered slowly and through a conversion experience a system of behavior and a series of actions that work for alcoholics who want to stop drinking. Close quote. As a man who pulled together threads of psychology, theology, and democracy, he was described by Aldous Huxley as, quote, the greatest social architect of our century, close quote. Wilson's experiments in trying to accelerate the process of transformation were not widely supported, and the focus remained on the 12-step recovery program. Well, this makes sense in the light of the understanding that the shift in balance from personal mind to non-personal universal mind takes time and practice to become fully established. Attempts to try to force the pace ahead of the natural progression tend to create more personal problems rather than the desired relief from suffering. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung supported the idea that we unwittingly tend to use substances and behaviours to relieve the natural desire for spiritual union. He wrote to Bill Wilson in 1961 and used the phrase spiritus contra spiritum, which neatly summarises the idea that addiction is a block to natural spiritual progress and that spiritual principles are the solution to addiction. And he also stated in his letter, quote, I'm strongly convinced that the evil principle prevailing in this world leads the unrecognized spiritual need into perdition." Close quote. Well, these are strong words, but they are entirely consistent with the understanding that it is our over-identification with the personal ego mind that causes all of the trouble. We are trying to satisfy the inherent spiritual desire for happiness, peace, love and unity through all manner of selfish and self-centered behavior, all of which leads us further away from the solution that is already present in non-personal consciousness. Once this mistake is recognized and understood, then we become willing to turn our attention inwards towards consciousness itself, rather than outward towards momentary relief in the material world. Whichever way we turn, we find that the model of non-dual consciousness provides all of the answers. If we want sustained freedom from the suffering of the personal ego mind, then we need to cease the obsession with the personal self and focus instead on self-forgetting. This is best done through regular spiritual practice rather than trying to force the issue through unsustainable use of artificial stimulants.